Okay, thank you very much for being here. There is a bit of an echo. Switch off the sound. So how do that? Where is the sound here? Right. Okay. No, thanks again. Happy New Year to everybody. You may remember that, or not, or no, in any case, that 25 years ago this week, we actually moved to Economic and Monetary Union. It was not the introduction, the physical introduction of the euro, because that came 2 years later, but we actually fixed irrevocably the exchange rates, and the ECB took over the management of fully the management of monetary policy in EMU. So it's a bit telling in a sense. We are lucky that we have this launch of the EMU Lab with this important first event precisely at the anniversary of the euro. And by the way, maybe just a little information. Giancarlo Corsetti and myself, we have finalizing a paper precisely on the experience with the 25 years of EMU, and it will be posted, and we'll welcome the comments by everybody. We'll post it as EMU Lab contribution in the next days. You have seen the title of this session. The euro is not what we expected to be. Discuss. So that's precisely what we want to do today. And the euro is not what we expected to be in the good and in the bad. Certainly, if you take EMU, the E, the M, and the U are not what were, what was planned 25 years ago. So the E, with all the economic policy coordination element, with the single market, clearly was underdeveloped 25 years ago. We have done quite a lot of progress. It remains probably underdeveloped today, probably even without probably. The M certainly was conceived with the ECB having a certain status and mandate. It has become also forced by events something different than the copycat of the Bundesbank at the time. And for those who, and I lived it, on my own skin in my previous life as a senior official of the Commission during the global financial crisis, even the EU somehow has been called into question. At a certain point, we thought we were on the brink of, putting a cross on the EU in general terms during the financial crisis, more specifically in the summer 2015, when the debate on the Grexit came to the fore. So we'll have to, in a sense, rethink the three elements. And the purpose of the laboratory, the EMU Lab, is precisely this. So get a new impulse, try to find a new way to unstuck the debate, which has remained in policy terms pretty stuck now for quite a few years. And this is a bit the purpose of the lab. Laboratory, we chose the word with Giancarlo precisely in that spirit. And when you enter into a laboratory, you try new things. Sometimes the molecule works well. Sometimes it blows up in your face. But we decided not to be too risk averse and enter into this discussion and this exchange precisely in that spirit. So today, the event, you have seen the speakers, fantastic panel. Just running through here beside me, Catherine Schenk, Oxford University, Barry Eichengreen, Berkeley, Adam Tooze, Columbia, We have Martin Sambu from the commented from the Financial Times, and then we have the Waltraud and Schelkle and Emmanuel Moulin-Droll, les enfants du pays, from the EUI. So we don't have all that much time. I would like to have as much interactions as possible. So kick-off statements, and Martin will regulate the traffic beside giving his own wisdom to the discussion. Just I finished by mentioning the next rendezvous, because this is the first EMU Lab. What is already foreseen is that on 16th of February in the morning, we are going to have Isabel Schnabel from the board of the ECB, who is going to give the inaugural lecture, the annual lecture on the EMU Lab. And then we are planning, have planned 2 EMU Lab in the following months. One, and I look at Thorsten, on banking, capital market, financial union in May, and we are starting to think also to have an EMU Lab on fiscal in March. So that is the. Beside this, we'll organize a number of seminars more dedicated. So it will be a bit a varied menu with all one key feature, which is that we would like, and you will see for the composition of the panel, we would like to have a multidisciplinary approach, bringing together the different departments of the EUI and interacting with the rest of the world, both other academics, policymakers, market participants. So in a bit of multidisciplinary interactive approach, because I mean, it seems to me that in order to deal with the issues that very difficult, politically charged issues we would like to discuss, you need to have a broad perspective. So economists per se are not enough, historian neither, political scientists neither. So we try to bring together all these different sensitivities. I think here we are, and hand over to Martin to kick off.
Thank you very much. Does Giancarlo want to say anything before we start? No? So you've spoken on both of your behalves. I'm Martin Sandbu. I'm the European economics commentator at the Financial Times. It's a delight to be here. Now, of course, you made the fatal and very un-Montesquieuan mistake of not dividing power here, and you've made me judge, jury, and executioner, because I'm both supposed to moderate and give my own impulse statements, you call them. Now, I was told these were to be max 5 minutes. So I'm going to be very strict and kind of put on a timer that rings embarrassingly when 5 minutes have passed, and then you'll know it's time to stop. But in that way, we'll have time for a second round so people can respond, and we'll then open to discussion. So as you said, Marco, this really should be a discussion. I mean, I really like the word choice. Words are important. It's a lab, it's a workshop. These are impulse statements to further discussion. So the idea is to be quite creative, right? So it's not a traditional panel. Everyone's been set, I guess we can think of it as an essay question. The euro is not what we expected it to be, discuss. So all the panelists will have their own, and will in a minute give their take on that. I'll do you in the order you appear in the program, except I'll go last, at least to be a little bit more polite, since I have this dual role. When I was an undergraduate student at Oxford, we got essay questions, and we had to read out our essays to the professors in their offices. So everyone had a terrible essay crisis the night before, and 5 minutes was about as long as you got to read out your very tentative answer to questions like this. But we have some of the best thinkers really in the world on these issues here. So we look very much forward to hearing their thoughts. I apologize in advance that 5 minutes is very short, and you obviously have much more to say than can be said in 5 minutes, but give it your best. And we'll start with Catherine.
Okay, the clock is running. I heard 5 to 7 minutes, so we'll see. So the euro is not what we expected it to be discussed. I think we expected it not to be to be what we expected it to be in the end. It's interesting to live through the evolution of the last 25 years of the euro, which is history in itself. It had 3 goals: to increase integration, this kind of the great European project through common institutions, enhancing price stability through convergence, perhaps convergence toward a nice Bundesbank kind of approach, but also to decrease trade and payments frictions. I'm going to stress a little bit the payments frictions because it arises from my own interest. But there's also a sort of a geopolitical sort of underlying aspect to this. And I think one of the not so much spoken about at the time aims was also that the euro would sort of disrupt the global monetary system. And indeed, the euro might come to rival the US dollar as an international currency and thereby project some geopolitical power. And I think this has been disappointed. As a reserve currency, it's about the same proportion as it was when it started, about 20%. So there's been no movement there. In terms of foreign exchange turnover, share of foreign exchange turnover has declined slightly, probably from 38 to 31%. The Deutschmark certain share was higher before the euro was introduced. So the increase of other currencies like the Chinese yuan or the renminbi has been at the expense of the euro, not at the expense of the US dollar primarily. In terms of SWIFT payments, the euro is about 27% in 2022, about half the value of US dollars. And again, this is a very stable sort of picture for the data that we have from 2011. A further aspect was the kind of urge towards price stability or price convergence, but not convergence to an inflationary situation, but to convergence to something sort of like a Deutschmarkizing sort of aspect. And this was very much in the discussion in the 1980s and 1990s. And a lot of those divisions were exposed, of course, during the sovereign debt crisis, and others may speak about that. So certainly there has been price convergence or inflation convergence, but a lot of that has taken place during a period of very, very low inflation, historically low inflation rates. And the more inflationary environment that we've been in the last few years, I think, has exposed the more dispersed nature of inflationary pressures. In terms of political convergence and creating the common institutions that will draw the grander European project together, certainly, as I'm speaking from as a British citizen and a Canadian citizen, it was easier for Britain to leave the European Union because it did not have the euro. So that's one lesson to those who are not in the Eurozone at the moment. Think of Hungary and Poland until most recently. On the other hand, there's the lesson of Greece, and while there's debate about the treatment of Greece during the sovereign debt crisis, certainly other countries don't want to have to go through it, and the pain that this exposed their populations to. So there's a sense in which maybe the Eurozone is solid for the moment, but whether it can be expanded further is something that I think needs to be discussed. And indeed, the countries that are not in the euro, like Hungary, maybe, and like Poland until the last election, there is a centripetal sort of effect there in their political economy. I wanted to talk a little bit about the payment system, which is something that intrigues me. And this has more to do maybe with the citizens' experience of a European monetary union. So we have the real-time gross settlement system being set up from the outset with Target. Then you had Target 2. You now, in March 2023, launched T2 because it's getting so much more nifty. But again, T2, there's problems and there's frictions there. And indeed, there were several system outages in November 2023. There's SEPA, the Single European Payments Agreement arrangement, the credit transfers, and then debit transfers. But on the retail level, I think there's still a lot of frictions. And I think this is not as well recognized. So particularly in terms of card payments and the ability to cross-border using cards for payments. So it's a cross-border problem. It's not a cross-currency friction. And that has to do with the the really entrenched national structures, both for payments and for card systems, which I think is an important but sometimes neglected aspect. So I would say that these cross-border frictions really do still persist. And I think we would have expected in 1999 that they would have been reduced at this level. And I feel like my alarm has gone. I don't want to make...
we will have another round, so
Okay.
then we will pick up. Extremely interesting. Thank you very much. Barry, you're next.
So like a good Oxford undergraduate, I've written out my answer to Marco's essay question. Actually, he gave us a list of questions, and I will focus on one, namely, why didn't the euro lead to fiscal and political union? One answer would be that the architects of the euro area didn't want it to lead to fiscal and political union. There were plenty of people who saw the euro narrowly as a way of saving the stable exchange rates of the European monetary system from the depredations of hedge fund managers and others, and thereby ensuring that the single market would survive. They thought that the euro could function perfectly well without a large euro area budget and without a system of interstate taxes and transfers. Indeed, they preferred it that way. And in the absence of that kind of fiscal union, there was no need for a political union to provide governance of that, of those fiscal decisions. That, incidentally, has been the view in my country for much of its history. The United States had a single currency. We call it a uniform currency for historical reasons, depending on how you define it, as early as 1791 or maybe 1865, after the National Banking Act had been adopted and the US Civil War ended. For much of the subsequent period, the ambit of the federal treasury was strictly limited. The Constitution limited the ability to, the federal government's ability to raise revenues to customs duties, collecting customs duties and selling land. It basically took the passage of the 16th Amendment to the US Constitution in 1913, like a century and a half after the country had gained its independence, half a century after the National Banking Act, to make a proper income tax possible, allowing the federal treasury to finance more than a small handful of core functions. That income tax was ratcheted up for 2 years when we were active participants in World War I, and then it was ratcheted right down again. It took the Great Depression of the 1930s and World War II, those more extended crises, for that tax to be implemented on a meaningful, persistent basis, finally giving the federal government the capacity to make economically significant income transfers from booming to depressed states. I would answer Marco's related question: why didn't the euro lead to convergence in terms of labor markets and to more labor market flexibility? In exactly the same way, economic historians like Gavin Wright have written eloquently about how the US North and US South had separate labor markets for much of US history, even while having a common currency. So different labor market institutions in the North and the South, very limited levels of labor market integration between the regions, until there were a series of big shocks leading to the Great Migration, the Dust Bowl, World War II, et cetera. So I draw two lessons from this. Number one, even those champions of the euro who saw a logic running from monetary union to fiscal union and from there to political union overestimated how quickly those connections would operate, how quickly those neo-functional spillovers, as my late great Berkeley colleague Ernie Haas called them, would manifest themselves. And number two, that a very large shock is required typically to catalyze this shift from monetary union toward fiscal union and political union. So some of us were talking about this a little bit earlier. Some people thought that the shock of COVID and with the shock of COVID, next generation EU would be Europe's Hamiltonian moment, or maybe that the war in Ukraine coming on top of COVID would catalyze Europe's Hamiltonian moment. With hindsight, we can say it hasn't turned out that way, at least yet.
Thank you very much. With 14 seconds to spare.
That's what you get
You-
when you
you
write
get-
it out.
You get it back. You get it back in the next round. Adam Tooze, please. Next.
Well, may I first say a great thank you to the organizers of the event, and wish the lab all the very best in its endeavors. This does seem to be something I think we absolutely need to have, and the EUI is the obvious place to have it. And the team in charge is a great, extraordinary combination of economic expertise and practical experience. The question is a fascinating one. I think one way to begin to answer it is to say that if you want to know why the euro is not what we expected, the crucial thing to ask, first of all, is who's the we in the question? Because I think if you're the French, this is probably not actually the case. You might even say that they've got the euro they hoped to get. By this, I mean that the euro was really from the beginning an agreement to enter into a wrestling match over the future construction of European monetary politics, to shift the terms from the Bundesbank-centered previous models to one in which there was collective action, and then to see where the chips fell. And the people who definitely have not ended up with the euro that they expected are German conservatives. And it's not by accident that the AfD is called the AfD. The Alternative für Deutschland that the AfD originally had in mind was an alternative to the new Eurozone that Mario Draghi was creating. And so that, I think, is a crucial early point to make, which is there was really no we. There was, in fact, a multiplicity of different actors that agreed in a political process to engage in a struggle. Both sides maybe liked to pretend to themselves that's not what they were doing. I think, frankly, on the French side, it would be naive to assume that was the case. I think they knew exactly what they were doing. I think an Italian political elite thought that it was essentially wrangling its domestic interest groups around the structure of the EU, the famous vincolo esterno, but the French were engaged in an open struggle with the Germans. The German conservatives maybe kidded themselves that this was game, set and match, and they were just going to get the Bundesbank, and they are the people who have been proven wrong. What I think neither the French nor the Germans nor the Italians reckoned with is quite how expensive this struggle was going to be, because it has proven ruinously expensive for large parts of the Eurozone. As Marco said to me rather cold-bloodedly after lunch today, well, Adam, yes, when historical things like this are carried out, there are winners and there are losers. People get hurt, and people have been hurt. Very dramatically, entire generations of young people coming through the labour markets of Spain, Italy, Greece, Ireland, and so on. Really a huge, something which from an American political point of view is barely comprehensible. Spain has a labour market roughly the same size as Texas. And if you told a Texan they were going to have prolonged youth unemployment of 35%, American politics would stop dead in its tracks. The sort of people who experience 35% youth unemployment are Native Americans, not white Texans, right? So this is a remarkable, costly experiment in a struggle, which has been resolved, I think, broadly speaking, in the direction of a normal central bank, which is essentially the French terms. Why was it quite as expensive as it was? Well, in part, these kind of bargains are always going to be expensive, as Marcus said. But I think the other reason is that in the founding of the EU, the monetary union rather, there was a profoundly naive perception of what money in Europe at the time was about. And in discussions about the EMU, I think far too often we ignore the role of financial capitalism as the actual driver of the chaos in 2008, 9, and 10. One of the things which endeared Marco to me enormously was when he first came to New York in 2015, he said publicly, as a European official, it's actually a malign historical accident that Greece became the center of the Eurozone monetary crisis, because really it should have been about Ireland and it should have been about Spain, because it was a crisis about banking. And it was an after effect, an aftershock rippling through the much broader North Atlantic banking crisis in which European banks were profoundly involved, and for which the Eurozone had no answer, because it essentially ended up relying on the Federal Reserve to provide the liquidity necessary to see the European mega banks through that crisis, because otherwise we would have had doom loops by the half dozen in 2008-9, as the Netherlands, the Belgians, the French, the Germans attempted to deal with a kind of fallout that was coming down from their mega banks in 08-09. So I think, to me, these are the two elements which help answer this question. It was from the outset kind of underdetermined how the Eurozone was going to emerge. It was always going to be a struggle. And I think one side has won it, essentially, but at a much higher price than anyone reckoned with, because we had such profoundly naive picket fence, ordoliberal understanding of how capitalism actually functions, which was very far from the reality of either the European megabanks or the regionally centered mortgage banking institutions that drove the go-go years of the early 2000s.
Thank you so much. Again, exactly on time. It's amazing. You guys are great. Emmanuel Moulin-Truol, please. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Yes, it works. So the euro is not what we expected it to be. If it were an essay question, I'd also start as Adam by saying that the most important part is the we. Are we talking of the expectations of the public that are difficult to evaluate? Are we talking of the expectations from academic economists that are related to specific economic theories? Or are we talking about expectations from policymakers? What I'd like to focus on are the expectations from policymakers, as this is most closely related to my own research interests and to the book I'm currently finishing on the history of the euro. And I'd actually argue that the euro, as it has evolved since Maastricht, is actually what many policymakers expected it to be. Let me take two of the most famous travels of the euro area: fiscal coordination and banking regulation supervision. Actually, I had in mind a third one, but I want to stay in time for the 5 minutes. Let's start with fiscal coordination. So you would be familiar with the Delors report, which provided a blueprint for the creation of the euro, and that was drafted by a group of central bankers chaired by Jacques Delors in 88 and 89. We now have access to the records of the meetings, and in one of them, Delors said, I quote, "You understand that it is possible for the European Council to accept a new institution in the monetary field. But if we propose a new institution on the economic side, that means a revolution in the institutional framework of the community." End of quote. No one wanted a revolution. And no revolution happened, and still no one wants a revolution. Yes, the fiscal coordination framework has, since 1992, and even before 1992, for better or for worse, that's not my point, been considerably sophisticated. But we still haven't gone through the sort of revolution that would represent the creation of a new institution on the economic side that would be comparable institutionally and politically to what the European Central Bank was and has become on the monetary side. Again, I'm not arguing whether this is desirable or not. I'm just saying that this is pretty much what was expected. Now let's move to banking regulation and supervision. Very early on, there was very, very clear awareness that there was a mismatch between the free movement of capital in Europe and the banking of supervision that remained primarily national. In October 1987, the most senior EU body gathering banking supervisors warned that, I quote, "A unique situation will emerge whereby, when there will be a progressively unified banking system in the community, there will be no clearly identifiable single supervisory authority." I continue quoting, "If markets were to feel the lack of a common supervisory authority for the banking system as a whole, and to see those with supervisory responsibility as having primarily national concerns, the impression that the banking system was not properly supervised at the community level could be very strong and potentially harmful." We're in 1987. Isn't this a sort of simplified summary of the next 30 or 40 years that happened afterwards? In the early 2010s, the situation became unsustainable, and heads of government decided to create, however imperfect and incomplete it is, a banking union with a single supervisory mechanism. So the euro became what was expected it would become, namely a construct that would need a single supervisory mechanism, even more so since it was actually included in the Treaty of Maastricht. Actually, the possibility that the ECB would become one day the single supervisor was actually included in the Treaty of Maastricht. So whether we think about fiscal coordination, about the development of banking regulation supervision, or the role of the EU budget, there was a clear awareness of the euro's pitfalls. And in that sense, I think we could argue that the euro was what many policymakers expected it to be. And also, as expected, I think once we have explored all these aspects that are economic and financial, the final key question, political construct, do EU policymakers and EU citizens want to develop to improve the functioning of the euro? What sort of democratic accountability framework do they want to set up? And that remains, at least to me, one of the most important questions for the years to come.
How do you guys do it? It's amazing. Well, Waltraud, please. Thank you.
I thought this is going to be easy, but the 5 minutes will defy me, I'm sure. Like the last two, I also started with the we, and we haven't coordinated our contributions, which is why I had another one. Adam talked about basically the battle of ideas, as Brunner and Landau called it. Thank you, Odysseus, for around how monetary policy should be done in a unified currency. Emmanuel just talked about basically how the technocrats, so to speak, the Delors committee and so on, thought about what needs to be done, but down to the council. And you can read that in these reports like the Werner report or the McDougall report. They have foreseen a lot of the issues that we discussed later during the crisis. I take here the economists, because I think actually the economists were the only one that had actually formulated expectations fully. Catherine was quite right. The rest of us, just saw what's coming, although I was also an economist at the time, and I come to this. They did not expect, the economists did not expect it in two senses. Almost every economist I know expected the euro to be disappointing in the optimum currency area sense. There was this path-breaking article by Eichengreen and Whiplosh on the shocking aspects of European monetary integration, and it basically formulated that in 1992-93, what we should expect in terms of disappointment. But I think this expectation of disappointment was actually quite misdirected. It was entirely predictable that the EU would not work according to this OCA theory that basically thought we all have to become similar. Peter Keenan had actually, who is always seen as one of the OCA crowd, as the young Peter Keenan, if you read this book in which 1969, when he makes his own contribution, he attacks Mandel and McKinnon and all of them, because he said, it's absurd to think that currency areas are created for sectorally specialized economies. They are always diverse. And what we learned in the crisis is asymmetric shocks, so country-specific shocks, and inflexible labor markets were really not the problem. This is a damning verdict on the economics of monetary integration, I think, not on the idea of creating a common currency. It was also, and somebody said it already, we didn't also expect it in another sense, namely financial cycles turning into a twin crisis, a crisis of banking and sovereign debt. It's now called the diabolic loop, but this is basically what it was. And again, Bodo, Eichengreen, and others have done some research on this early on in the 2000s, 2002, and that made the euro unexpectedly crisis-prone. And this is quite different from the OCA diagnosis that you hear still today, with its focus on these bloody asymmetric shocks. It was not an exogenous shock, but endogenous to monetary financial integration, and this integration went beyond the euro area. That is has been wonderfully told by Adam in his book Crashed. It was integration of the North Atlantic economies, the rich part of the world, and that was so notable about it. The cause was also not asymmetric but common. Europe, from the north to the south, from the west to the east, had somewhere a financial crisis. It was a common financial crisis. And even if there were countries that were not affected by a financial bust, Poland, Germany, France, and Italy, banks, at least from France and Germany, were heavily involved in financing bubbles elsewhere. So they were involved. And now, in case you wondered whether I was wrong, because I did write a book in 2001 and a book in 2017 about European monetary integration, later about the crisis. Yes, when I was still primarily an economist, I was also wrong. I published this book on the theory of monetary integration in 2001, and I argued that European currency unification had to be understood against the backdrop of financial instability and the scandalon of German dominance. After all this 1992-93 crisis, the EMS crisis, when everybody thought that's the killer of the whole monetary integration project, it was triggered by an asymmetric shock of German unification. So outside of the monetary union, it was there was an OCA case. So I also did not expect that the euro would be a transmission mechanism for destabilization and a financial collapse, rather than what I thought a stabilizing institution for risk pooling, and how that could be that it wasn't that it was this, that I was disappointed too, was then the topic of my second book, and I stopped.
Thank you so much, Waltraud. I was asked to provide my own comments, my own impulse statements. I of course have to impose the strict timing on myself, but I'll try to be. I should really be quicker because so much good has been said. I just want to pick up this thread of who is the we. So let me mention a few more. So there were economists, especially outside of the countries that became the euro area, who went further than saying there'll be trouble with asymmetric shocks. They said it wouldn't last, right? A lot of people thought it couldn't last. And at one point, it looked like they may end up being right. They didn't. But I think this is just worth stopping for a second, right? It hasn't disintegrated. No country has left the euro. More and more euros have been joining. And my take is that we have basically put behind us the existential threat that I've put down much more to discretionary policy mistakes than any design flaws in the euro itself, just not handling balance of payments crises as one should have. There was another negative expectation, which was that it would lead to worse growth, partly because of not dealing well with asymmetric shocks, right? Then you'll have suboptimal economic outcomes. I mean, that hasn't really happened either. So on the whole, the euro area has done pretty well in GDP per capita terms, at least up until the pandemic. It's been bad in the last few years, but if you compare the euro area and the US in per capita terms, yeah, pretty comparable. There were expectations this time on the both people sort of in favor and people against about what the political logic would be. Some of you have touched on it. I wanted to say a little bit more about it. What I want to say is that the sort of political outcomes many people expected from monetary integration, namely more economic and fiscal and therefore political union, to the extent it's happened not because of monetary integration, but because of the single market. So to the extent that there's been a move towards fiscal union and some sort of common European economic policy, it is the RRF and Next Gen EU, the post-pandemic recovery fund. And that happened at single market level for single market reasons, namely this desire not to get an unlevel playing field. That was both a political argument and probably the economic argument. So there's another sort of surprise here, at least for me, that it was always debatable whether monetary integration should have this political force to create these other forms of integration. In fact, it was something else altogether that seems to have pushed that process along. So that's something to bear in mind, I think. I'll finish on just some thoughts for the future. It seems to me that, and this is kind of thinking about what the EMU Lab could do as well, I think we often get into these incorrect expectations when we focus too much on the institutional and union part. So the euro is there, it's there to stay. At the retail level, of course, people just use it, right? It's just the money. We should be talking about what should the policies in and of this currency area be? What should be the best monetary policy? how should the central bank act? It's made many mistakes. It's improved. It's now, as Adam said, pretty much a normal central bank. That in itself will help the euro hold together. But we should talk about policies either to make the euro function better or just to make the economy of the euro area function better. So in a sense, I think we'll get to better answers if we talk a little bit less about the euro itself with this assumption that there are these design flaws that need to be fixed. We need to have better economic management. I'll finish on just mentioning where those are most relevant to monetary unification itself, namely on the flow of money and the singleness of money. So I found Catherine's points about payment frictions within the euro area extremely interesting. I hope you will say a bit more about that. I mean, that's worrying. It shouldn't be like that. We know that the banking union isn't complete. To the extent that there is a sort of political goal for the banking union, it seems limited to preventing the doom loop in what remain national banking systems rather than create a truly European banking system. The third point, I think we should be thinking very hard about what the opportunities are from a central bank digital currency. A digital euro seems to be on the way. I think it's wide open what it could lead to, and I hope that's something you will work on in the lab. I'll stop there before I embarrass myself by running into the time limit. So we've all done a sort of first round. Thank you so much for putting up with my strictness, but it means that we have plenty of time to keep going. We'll do a second round on the panel before we open up. I might just go in the same order to let people kind of give their next thoughts or reactions. But is there anyone who sort of immediately has something on their mind that they want to pick up from what they heard, or should we just go in the same? All right, Catherine, seems like it's on you.
Well, maybe pick up a little bit on the CBDC, and I'm sure Barry has some comments on this also. It always seemed to me that central bank digital currencies were a solution in looking for a problem. And a lot of the initiative came from central banks feeling they were losing their policy space to other kinds of DLT. I'm not sure I see this as the answer, and I know that there's been initiatives most recently in November to begin the planning for the digital euro. So I'm slightly pessimistic about the usefulness and the extent that it will change things and how useful it will be. I did want to pick up a little bit of more about the dynamics here. So, and the relationship between the Eurozone and the European project. And I wanted to challenge perhaps the panelists to think, I mean, other countries are now committed to join the Euro. Is that going to be sustainable? Is it going to strengthen the Euro if you get all these other countries in? Or is it really just being pushed off into the greater distance, in which case you will have a kind of a permanent Eurozone within Europe or not? And I think the other thing that I mentioned that people haven't mentioned is that the European Union has not been stable through this period. And indeed, there has been a country that left. And I think that needs to be factored into what is otherwise quite a self-congratulatory, not self-congratulatory, but a kind of an optimistic story, perhaps, except maybe for Valtron, of, well, it's still here, folks, after 25 years.
Did anyone want to pick up directly on any of the points Catherine made, or should we just, I will just go to you, Barry.
So I'm going to defend shocking aspects of European monetary unification, and then I will follow with a mea culpa. It was an article actually together with Tam Bayumi, who has an irresistible temptation to pun. So that's where the title came from. And our point was really not to say this is Europe's future, but to point to what kind of changes in the distribution of disturbances Europe would have to manifest in order for its monetary union to operate more or less like the American, and ask what kind of adjustments was it plausible to expect Europe to manifest. So if you look at the published version of the paper, it comes with discussant comments where the discussants raise these issues and say very interesting historical comparisons, but what should we expect going forward? Emmanuel and banking union, that's a great quote I didn't know it. And I think maybe it's indicative of who fell down here, and that elaborates on something Waltraud said as well, that there's essentially nothing that I'm aware of in the scholarly literature that links monetary union to banking union before the turn of the century. So the strand in the policy world that you flagged was suppressed by those of us in the academic world. So that's maybe where economists fell down. So I agree with what Adam said about how the ECB has evolved away from a stylized vision of the Bundesbank as opposed to the real Bundesbank toward being a proper central bank. But I disagree with the implication that youth unemployment in Spain should be laid on the doorstep of the euro. As you're well aware, we have to think about the counterfactual when we do this kind of history. What would the counterfactual behavior of the European economy subjected to these various disturbances from outside have been, with 15 separate national currencies, supposedly with relatively stable exchange rates against one another, and a single market still in the making? It's an important question to ask, and it's above my pay grade to answer.
Adam, you're next on the sheet, and you may want to answer some of those or address some of those questions.
I think that's a reasonable pushback, Barry. I guess to really specify the criticism, you'd have to figure out a counterfactual in which an independent Spain, a Spain not in the Eurozone, presumably did not have the extreme boom bust experience and then was not subject to the same it'll work out, and you'd have to factor in the persistently high structural level of youth unemployment in Spain all along. So
I was trying to put that task on you.
yeah, so we shouldn't be populist in making this kind of argument, but it does seem to me that, and you after all in your own writing about this were not, I mean, you were quite justifiably critical. I was actually just making a list because this question of who the we is came up so many times, and it strikes me that for the lab, this actually might be a rather useful checklist to have. Like, and I think it could be a distinctive contribution of the lab to actually widen the range of the implied we in our thinking about the Eurozone. So I have got governments of the North and the South, broadly speaking, of crisis and non-crisis countries. I have peoples. This was, Emmanuel, your suggestion that we might look at this from the bottom up. We have experts, Waltraud's suggestion. We have, then you think you could dig into this if you really want to know who are the people who are most worried. It'd be something like savers or some sort of notional vision. We would have the employed population of Europe, what would once have been called labor or workers. Then I think we would want to break up capital or business into different groups. I mean, one of the real ironies of the crisis is that though Europe bent over backwards to avoid doing painful restructuring of the banks, the actual eventual outcome for the European banking system of this shock was terrible. So there's unlike in the American case where there is kind of a direct connection between policy intervention and subsequent development of the banking system. There's a profound dysfunction, I think, in the European case, but one could look at other sectors. Another, I think, underrated victim of the Eurozone crisis is the renewable energy push and investment drive in Europe. Again, Barry, you may want to query the causal logic here, but there is a remarkable correlation between the onset of austerity and the Eurozone crisis and the collapse of investment in renewable energy in Italy and Spain from 2010, 2011 onwards. So there is a series of effects here that we could bring in. But I think maybe crucially, and this is where I'll end, one of the effects, and Martin, you've written very effectively about this, one of the effects of the euro has been to create a common European discourse about economic crisis and economic policy. It has enabled and driven and forced a collective conversation in a way that I think nothing else quite could. So there's a way in which the we here is some sort of notionary, not just of citizen and the pollster's subject of the European, but something closer to a notion of European citizenship that's really implied by the monetary system and invoked by it. It's selective, it doesn't involve everyone in Europe. But to a considerable segment of the political class of the euro area, it has become it's why we care about each other's elections for long periods of time, right? It became a really critical driver of mutual concern and mutual engagement.
Thanks very much, Emmanuel.
Yes, I actually wanted to follow up on your point, Martin, about the fact that the political outcomes that we saw recently happened because of a single market logic, not so much of EMU. And I got two points related to this. The first one, I would agree. Perhaps I would nuance it for the banking union, because the banking union, the immediate logic was more EMU related, even if in the end it's open to everyone. But my point is not so much that it's that actually I wonder whether this as well was not expected. I mean by this that all the instruments we're thinking about, common borrowing, the role of cohesion funds, more broadly, the role of financial transfers in the European Union or in a monetary union, even fiscal coordination, the coordination of economic policies, were elements that were thought from the beginning out of the common market, not the monetary union. And the origins of regional policy are out of correcting the problems linked to the creation of the common market. The origins of common borrowing are related to making the common market work and making the European monetary system work a little bit on the margin. The origin of the coordination of economic policies, it's also completely related to the common market in the 60s and 70s. Then it got further justified by EMU, and then yes, we could have asked ourselves whether it could have been born explicitly out of the euro area. But at the same time, the intellectual origins are completely coming out of the common market. And we're here hitting something that is very difficult to understand historically, is the connections, the interconnections between the making of a common market and the making of a monetary union. Not least because monetary union is not included in the Treaty of Rome, but as soon as the European Economic Community is created, very early on in the Commission, people's policymakers say, we want to create a common market. The logical consequence will be one day to have fixed exchange rates and a monetary union. So it's completely consubstantial in the discussion at some point. So that's why I think it could have been expected that these instruments would develop out of the common market rather than the single market rather than the monetary union. Second point, and genuine open question: can we work out a counterfactual? Can we work out a situation whether in the past, now, or in a few years' time, we imagine heads of governments of the euro area saying to basically the non-euro EU members, you're very nice, we're a bit tired with you, we create a specific budget for the euro area. That would be politically and even legally difficult, perhaps more politically difficult than it would be legally difficult, because you can always create a new treaty. But then there would be problems with ratification. So I'm just putting that on the table. What sort of counterfactual could we have imagined whereby the instruments we're talking about would have been born out specifically of the structures of the euro area rather than the structure of the EU as a whole?
Thank you. I first have to respond, of course, to Barry, because I did, that I mixed it up with a paper that you wrote with Wiplosz is no coincidence, because I used it a lot to discuss the 1992-93 crisis. It was a wonderful account together with the comments. Now, in your shocking aspects, you did say in a way there has to be a lot of convergence. It was fairly orthodox, and it did a lot to revive OCA theory. And I really feel this was a real problem. And funnily enough, the One Market, One Money report never had actually a box on why they're not relying on optimum currency area theory. But then the ECB starts to talk about it in the early 2000s, and that these labor markets have to be now reformed, turning the whole logic completely on its head. So determining ex ante optimality of a currency area that no currency area ever has done, and then saying, oh no, we create this currency area that's suboptimal, but then you have to change everything to adjust to this common currency. I mean, it is it was a proposition by economists, and I'm afraid by the Commission, that makes you almost a Euro skeptic, right? And I think Andrew Rose gave you the comment on this paper, and doesn't he end by saying, this wonderful paper by Bayumi and Eichengreen tells us that we actually have really no theory of crisis, and even their historical evidence, and they have tried hard and done a good job, is telling us that we cannot compare. Coming a bit back to this uniqueness, that is a serious problem for studying the Euro, and you have to be go back to basics in a way to understand it. And one of the things you did now was to go back to the basics of US American history. And it is a very different one. And they had the same diabolic loops just because they didn't have a central bank, but they had a fiscal integration. So the two things, that is the problem of state money that we all have. I wanted to say one thing to Catherine about this enlargement problem. I really think it gets a bit more complicated for the ECB with all these small countries, but frankly, they are well paid and can deal with this. As regards Brexit, I think Brexit has surprisingly, and everybody, including this research project in which I am, expected a major membership crisis, a domino effect. And de facto, the opposite happened. We looked at how right-wing parties, commented on that on social media. It died down by 2017. It really, they never got any resonance even from their own, people who vote for these parties. And since then, people like Marine Le Pen have given up on having a referendum on Euro membership and all that. I mean, it did show what advantage to have for all the reasons that Martin has talked about. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Thanks everyone very much. I'll very soon open up to questions from the audience in the room, but also those watching online. Do put questions into the chat or Q&A box, and they will come my way. I just want to also react a little bit to some of the points that have been made. Following up, I think, on some of Adam's points, I just want to re-insist on the importance of separating analytically what are problems of the Euro and what are problematic policies in the Euro area. And you mentioned examples like unemployment in Spain, like the lack of or the fall in renewables investment. I suppose that the kind of theory here is insufficient demand because of restrictive policy, or perhaps the very restrictive financial conditions because of the capital flows. I mean, as we know, the ECB policy on this has changed, right? Mm-hmm. So Christine Lagarde backtracked her remarks on not being here to close the spreads. In practice, we know that the ECB has and will use instruments to prevent spreads from getting out of hand. They are using their monetary transmission mechanism argument to basically say, look, we do care about the financial conditions in individual countries as well. My point is just all of this is possible within the structure, and a lot of it becomes, what do we choose to do inside that structure? But then the question, of course, is immediately, is this actually a policy problem for the Eurozone or some other constellation of countries? So Emmanuel made this very interesting thought experiment. Could we imagine actually a political process that led to a Euro budget? And I agree, I find it a little bit hard to imagine, but I find it a lot easier to imagine sub-27 budgets for other purposes, defense, for example, or this year maybe a budget at 26 to fund Ukraine. And we can think of other sorts of policy areas, but a lot of them don't actually coincide with the monetary union. So again, depending on what problem we're trying to solve, I think the question always has to be asked, well, for what area is this a problem, and hence where is the level of policy intervention? And it may or may not be in the monetary union. Some of the policies where I do think we need to think at the level of the monetary union have to do with one market, one money, but as several have pointed out, we don't actually fully have one money. We don't have one market either in banking. So there's work to do there. But to the extent that we don't even have one money because of frictions or because of a lack of an integrated banking system, so you can't just open a deposit account in a different Eurozone country, at least not easily. That is clearly a policy challenge for the monetary union and needs to be fixed. And that brings me finally to CBDC again, just to quickly give an answer to Catherine's skepticism from my much more enthusiastic point of view. I mean, if a central bank does worry about losing policy space, they should do something about it, right? So maybe CBDC is a good solution there, but you may have been disputing that they actually are losing policy space. But I'll just quickly mention some other uses of CBDC. One is obviously as a monetary policy tool. It allows you, more easier negative interest rates, for example. It has a function in the international role of the euro, possibly. And there's some research on how there's a first mover advantage in going to a digital currency if international trade starts to adopt it as the means of transaction. They will go with whatever is a big country that first introduces it in an open convertible way. But most of all, programmable money. So Hyun Shin at the BIS has a fantastic analogy on this. He says that digital currencies, CBDCs, they're like the iPhone. So when the iPhone was invented, there was just no way of imagining what sort of apps people would build for it. We just, in 2006, we wouldn't have been able to imagine how it changes the way we just live our everyday life. And his point is that a programmable central bank digital currency is sort of the same thing. It would create a programmable safe money that fintech companies or even banks, if they manage to stay with the times, could develop solutions for, and all sorts of smart contracts we can't imagine now could very quickly take off. So I think we are underestimating the industrial policy case, if you like, for a CBDC, namely to create this sort of environment for a European fintech industry. So I'll stop there, and I will take a couple of points from the room and very quickly get to comments from online. But let's get some of the people in the audience. Torsten first, and we'll take a couple if they come up before we go back to the panel.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this exciting discussion. I want to make very briefly.
Could everyone introduce themselves to everyone here?
Okay, Torsten Beck. I'm also a local here. I'm director of the Foreign School of Banking and Finance. So 3 quick points. Since you mentioned retail payment system in the euro area, which I'm also a victim of because I have accounts in several countries, and digital currency. Just to clarify something, so the digital euro is not a CBDC. The digital euro is a retail, it's as it's currently planned, is a retail payment system. So actually the CBDC, the digital euro is supposed to be exactly what you pointed to, Catherine, kind of closing this gap to be able to send money across borders within a couple of seconds, which, and I mean, ultimately, as I understand it now, the main reasons for that, they want to introduce the digital euro, so I shouldn't use CBDC, the digital euro, it is supposed to be a European PayPal system. So it is kind of this geopolitical, again, the geopolitics comes in here saying, well, what if the Americans cut us off? Then we have an alternative in place. So that's at least the current planning, as far as I understand it. That's what it is supposed to be about. I mean, we can have a much longer discussion about CBDC. I'm much more skeptical than you are, Martin. But second, on the geopolitics, following up on that, and I was actually surprised Barry didn't bring this up because you co-authored a paper, I think, on that, right? Was it Mars versus Venus or Mercury versus Venus? Was you, Barry, right? Or this paper on the currency reserves, maybe I'm confusing you, sorry. On the currency reserves and the role of a currency as a reserve currency and the political role of a country and the military alliances. And of course, since the Euro area or even the EU is not a political project, it's not a geopolitical project, at least not yet. Maybe it becomes one after Ukraine. That's would be one reasons why the euro is also not a reserve currency. But so that's just to put it out there. And then finally, very quickly on this multi-tier EU and what Emmanuel said. So I was just looking up. I mean, so the European Stability Mechanism is not an EU institution. It's a euro area intergovernmental institution. I mean, what prevents this to be repeated for other kind of institutions within the pure euro area? And I mean, originally the ESM was actually supposed to take on the role that the SRB now has, or the SRF, right? So it could actually, and I guess as we get more and more to this, to to a larger EU, to more smaller countries further east and further south joining, I guess we automatically get to a multi-tiered European Union, where agreements, in the absence of being able to actually change the treaty, which I think everybody has given up on, you have to come up with these kind of solutions that only have a subset of countries involved in it. Thanks.
Marco, you wanted to?
Okay, no, maybe others first.
Okay.
I can come. Yeah.
Catherine, you want to?
Yep, just of course, there's the Wero, as an Anglo-Saxon, I don't even know how to pronounce it, is coming forward. We need to remember there was the Monet in 2007, 2008. There was the Pepsi initiatives. It was the inability to create a European rival to Visa and MasterCard. So they've been unable, because of national regulation and regulatory practices, to create a European card. So they've gone to the European wallet, which is what you're talking about, and it is obviously distinctive. You kind of challenged me about the relationship between having the euro as an international currency, and it was never really meant for that, because Europe wasn't trying to achieve this geopolitical status and isn't a geopolitical force. And there's a bit of circularity, obviously, to that argument. And maybe it's only looking at it from the outside, but certainly it feels like, in similar ways to challenging the Visa and MasterCard, there is a challenge to the American dominance and the exorbitant privilege, if you wanted to go back to the 1960s, that it appears to some that the United States is able to glean from that power. And I think certainly at the time, there was, before even coming up 2005, before 2007, there was a lot of discussion about, well, when will the euro overtake the US dollar as the great reserve asset, remember? So
I'm just going to quickly address the CBDC issue. I mean, it is a retail CBDC, and I think what makes the difference here is that, as I understand the ECB's proposals, it will ultimately be backed by the central bank balance sheet, not directly, because it will be through banks, whereas PayPal is, of course, only ultimately on the private bank's balance sheet.
But so everybody, as far as I understand, everybody gets up to 3,000.
Yes,
it's
limited.
For more, you can actually, like in PayPal, you can send 10,000. You get 3,000 out of your wallet and then 7,000 from a bank account, which is linked to the CBDC. So that's why I'm saying it's a bit like a PayPal.
Everything above 3,000, I agree with you.
Marcello Messori, a very new entry at the Schuman Center, and many thanks for your stimulating contributions. And let me raise two short questions. The first, obviously, these questions relate to the peculiarity of the institutional organization of the European Union, and specifically of the peculiar combination between the centralized monetary policy and national fiscal policies. And my first question is, do you think that there are some specific theoretical routes to explaining this kind of combination? It seems to me quite important in order to overcome the possible distortionary problems to better understand possible theoretical explanation for that. And my second question relates to the possible consequences of this combination between the two policy levels, in particular in terms of financial flows. We have empirical evidence that there were distortion impacts. Nevertheless, I would like to have your point of view on that. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And let me add a question that's come in from online, because it's related. So Gianluca Flego says, I'm sort of puzzled when I hear that it's not so much of an issue of design flaws, but bad policy choices. The lack of policy coordination mechanisms seems very much of a design flaw to be. I suppose that's in response to some of my remarks, and that it's about fiscal policy coordination, or the lack of fiscal policy coordination, which is related to your question: centralized monetary, decentralized fiscal. Let me see if others want to answer that before I give my thoughts on either question. Anyone? Is there any reason to have, is there any justification for having centralized monetary and decentralized fiscal?
The McDougall report even was based on that theory. I mean, it's fiscal federalism. That is what fiscal federalism is, right? You cannot have decentralized money, even though McDougall played with this idea in, irreconcilably fixed exchange rate. So everybody would still have the drachma and the lira and so on, but you could not change it exactly as Mandel had thought about, but said in the end, it's better to have a common currency, but then leave in line with the nation state preferences, leave fiscal policy decentralized. Thought, however, you need at least 5 to 7% or better 25% of a central budget. But when they then declinate through what that all would mean, I mean, a lot would have to be centralized according to that optimality thinking that was prevalent even at that time already in 1977.
I'd like to just follow up quickly too. I mean, the lack of fiscal coordination, I think, is a problem in any integrated, multi-country integrated economy, right? Whether you have a common currency or not, it will be a challenge. It will be different. And just also to follow up on the idea of how much you need to integrate on the fiscal side, that depends on how much you integrate on the private side, right? So we know that in the US, there's a lot of shock absorption, shock transfer through the private side, through the banking system and so on. So, what else happens in terms of integration will affect the answer to how much fiscal coordination or integration you need. Both Marco and Gianluca want to come in here.
Okay, on this final question, and then I would like to say something else on the previous discussion. Okay, I think in the Eurozone, in the EMU or in the EU in general, the jury is out on many things still. There is one thing on which the jury has come in and given its verdict, and that is on fiscal coordination for achieving an adequate fiscal stance for the Eurozone as a whole. Now, if you think that we can achieve that of adequate fiscal stance simply by coordinating national policies, I think you delude yourself. That is not going to happen. There is no way to make a country to choose a certain fiscal policy nationally for the sake of the Eurozone. So this is not going to happen. Now, and we tried for many years, we did not succeed. So the only way to achieve that is through vertical coordination, in which you supplement national fiscal policies with some centralized tool, which would allow them to achieve the fiscal stance that is adequate for the Eurozone as a whole. So this is a bit my view on this question of fiscal coordination. Second point I wanted to make is that I'm very happy, actually, that, and here Giancarlo can elaborate, that in several of the interventions, we go back to the roots of the single market. And indeed, I mean, if you go back 1987, Podolsky-Oppa report, efficiency, equity, and the third one, stability, you have the inconsistent quartet. So he adds on the classic macroeconomic Mandel, say, trilemma with the single market there. And I think there you find again the link with the single currency, because if you want to preserve the single market, then you want to avoid competitive devaluation. I remember the kind of acrimony that there was at the time with the ESM on competitive devaluation. So you want to avoid competitive devaluation to preserve the single market. What is the answer? The answer is EMU and the single currency. But then, if you do not have the kind of common policies that are needed for that, then the temptation there is to have national industrial policies. So how you which would, and we have, is the discussion of these days also, which would risk to fragment the single market. How do you avoid that? then is to have a EU industrial policy, put it in inverted commas, and with Marcello Messori, we have written extensively. So European public goods being at the roots of this European industrial policy. So I think this is the link which would come, which goes back to the real origin of with the single market, and then brings to the, you know, to fruition the rest of the channels.
Now that's an extremely illuminating remark. I think it hadn't struck me before, this analogy between the subsidy race today and the competitive devaluations of the pre-EMU era. Giancarlo.
Just a comment. So the EEA and the EU develops through a constant political process where reforms are way more far-reaching and revolutionary, the grand schemes. So I'm glad that I think Emmanuel brought back the idea that we needed a banking integration, banking union, 87, no, the first discussion. So one way to ask the fiscal issue is what is the fiscal requirement for a banking union? Because clearly there will be deposit insurance, clearly there will be resolution funds, clearly there will be political issues. Do we need to go to a fiscal federalism for a banking union? And the answer was, in many circles I discussed with, no, you need to understand what is the requirement for that. This is one lesson from the crisis. The other lesson from the crisis is that Mark was very right, but remember, the whole idea of the ECB came at a time in which we thought the monetary policy was enough to stabilize. And that argument was failing on two accounts. The first one is that sometimes monetary policy does not work. Like, you know, you have the zero lower bound. So you may want a fiscal capacity that guarantee the fiscal stance. And remember, for this fiscal capacity, you don't need fiscal federalism. In principle, you need something that intervenes in crisis period. And the second aspect is that not only in Europe, but everywhere in the world, we are revisiting the boundary between fiscal and monetary policy. And perhaps these boundaries are not as solid as we thought. And there is a basement, there is a plumbing below the independence and the distinction. There is like a basement where fiscal and monetary policy meet, where monetary policy stabilize the bond market against the instability that Adam was very keen and other people talk about. And on the other hand, the fiscal policy is ready to support monetary policy when needed so that they don't lose the ability to pursue their mandate. And here we had a discussion in New York with Barry Eichengreen, and I think Barry reminded me that negative capital for central bank do not work in theory, but in practice many times they do. But at the end of the day, what we really want is that the central bank is not forced to do something away from the mandate because of the negative capital. So that is the way I would put it. So I just stop here. But this is like, if you want to, I'm telling you what are, in my view, the boundary to think of the required reform of the fiscal framework that will make us live happier.
There are more questions on fiscal from online. Is it on the same thing? Yes, please go ahead.
Stefano Micossian, visiting fellow here and a retired economist. So the first point is a small point about decentralized fiscal policy. You know that when you look at market integration measures, our markets are much less integrated than the US markets. And I think when you talk about decentralized fiscal policy, you should keep this in mind, because there are a lot of distortions that are produced by local fiscal policies that probably play a role in explaining these divergences. The second point I wanted to make concerns the European Central Bank. Today has been the day of enthusiasm and hailing the great successes and all that. I've been raising for some time the following question. do we want the ECB to become an important or major player in the enforcement of common policies in the European Union? Because this is what has been happening now for some time. TPI is a straight example, because the ECB, like with the old OMT, would have to assess whether the member states are in line with common policy prescriptions before they intervene. And because they're independent, they have to take account, this is the rule, of all the policy prescriptions of all the other bodies, but it will be their decision. It is not going to be mechanically imported. So TPI is swelling a policy function for the ECB that I'm not sure we want. In the paper of our big paper on that was published yesterday on the history of the European Union, I think the two authors are rather explicit that they would not want the ECB to go back on the expanded role they have taken in preserving financial stability. But part of this expanded role is definitely the fact that they are now building up an apparatus to judge on the implementation of common policies and enforce the implementation of common policies. And I tend to think that this is not right.
Very good questions. Let me just add in two questions from online on the fiscal side of things, but we will discuss the ECB question too. So there's a question for both Barry and Adam on the US fiscal, but others may want to weigh in. Would you think that the kind of cross-border fiscal transfers that happen in the US would be feasible in the EU if subject to EU spending approval procedures, e.g. unanimity? I think we can just ask generally, could it be, under what conditions could that be feasible? And it relates to this comparison between how integrated the US states are and the EU member states are. Another question from David Howarth. A euro area budget was indeed on the agenda for a while. June 2018 was shelved in 2020. Do any of the speakers think that a euro area budget is still necessary economically and or politically? Barry and Adam, why don't you start by addressing some of the US comparisons and possibly the other questions too, and we'll see if others want to come in.
Just very, very briefly before I hand over to Barry, I mean, the obvious place to go is unemployment insurance, right? And to develop the existing rather minimal framing of risk and burden sharing within the EU to something more substantial. But in the excellent paper that Marco and Giancarlo prepared for the meeting, we also have, I think, some indication of why that will be difficult, because the spreads in unemployment across the euro area major economies are much wider than they are across the American states, except in the exceptional period of the 08-09 crisis. And so that obviously creates a bigger problem. It's a one-off problem if you could actually reach a deal within Europe on exactly the distribution of the costs, but that will be a step in that direction, I would have thought. Barry.
Yeah, I think the obvious political obstacle is that discussions of fiscal transfers in Europe do not occur under a veil of ignorance, and there has been a presumption over the years in which direction they will go. So fiscal union immediately gets relabeled transfer union in certain circles. And there's now the interesting question of going forward. Is it obvious in what directions fiscal transfers will go, given the changing fortunes of the different economies concerned? If you built your economy on the internal combustion engine and cheap energy and a rapidly growing China, what are your prospects going to be in the future?
Thank you very much. Any of you, the question on whether we want the ECB to be the enforcer it's turning into, and on whether we need economically or politically a euro area budget. Emanuele, you said it wasn't going to happen or it's politically unlikely, but is it necessary?
if we follow what Valtrud referred to frequently, the McDougall report that has been influential, yes. I think the key issue is that we need to agree, and that will never happen, on the level of the proportion of that budget and the level of transfer that is implied. Another way to think about it that can be useful is probably to think, again, not necessarily in EMU terms, but rather in the origins of the Treaty of Rome, which is about creating a common market, trying to help the regions that have most difficulties, in which case we can think about a stronger policy in terms of cohesion funds, or European unemployment insurance. Why? Because, I mean, the very first plans about European unemployment insurance in the 1970s were not just highlighting the fact that it was useful as a resource transfer, an automatic resource transfer. It was also useful just to show that the EU was here doing something. And one of the arguments was to say, if we create a European unemployment insurance, then on the payslip, you will have the contribution, and you will have, for those who are unemployed, the benefit. And that can be something that is useful for European integration. Then we can discuss. There were other voices that were arguing that it's not because you got on the postcard from Brussels with love that then suddenly you start loving the EU. But I think we need to avoid a debate that won't have a clear answer about the levels of transfers. We also need to take into account other aspects rather than just the economic ones.
Yeah, just question to anyone really. When Sure was implemented in the pandemic, did it actually show up on people's pay slips? It didn't, right? Did it say "with love from Brussels"? No. Valtrud.
But thanks for mentioning Sure. Adam, what I see as a problem, and by us always going back to the US as the one example we have that is as diverse and also strong state traditions, possibly more than in the EU now, is that we always think then in terms of a co-insurance system, like unemployment top-up. It can then only be fiscal. But what has been the strength of all the responses to the euro area crisis is, in my view, and since then, COVID, is that they have repeatedly agreed on a reinsurance system, because we are a union of fairly well-developed, especially in world comparison, even, Poland is a well-developed welfare state. And therefore, you need a system that reinsures the primary insurer of citizens, and do that in times when the primary insurer is overwhelmed. Because, and I'm saying that to Marco, fiscal federalism and this, we need more and fiscal coordination can't do it. And I agree with that point. But at the same time, if you integrate fiscal federalism doesn't have a terribly good record on guaranteeing all this, what is the basis of European monetary integration. And this is a relatively stable currency because it gives you low inflation. That's the disciplinarians want that. And low interest rates that what highly indebted countries want. It is the compromise and the two sides of the coin. If you introduce a fiscal federalism, you have all kinds of interaction effects. That's the political economy side. The states free ride on the federal government in the United States always give themselves balanced budgets and always play the, we hazard. It's that slump in Washington. Yeah, because each time you wait for them to bail you out. It's a quiet bailout in every bigger recession. And Europe cannot sustain this politically because you have very different fiscal philosophies, which is why I think it's actually a wise agreement that they have come to each time to say for a reinsurance agreement that is for a diverse union has the advantage. It can be categorically very different things. It can be monetary policy, it can be fiscal, it can be regulatory. And that's why when you take diversity seriously and don't always want to make it in the name of optimality, everybody the same, then you have to think anew about fiscal integration. And I think the reinsurance model like Sure is the way to go. What is unclear, and that's your question just now, Martin, is what's the politics of reinsurance? Do people say, yes, if we're really in trouble, the EU comes in and helps us out? Or does they say the EU comes only when we're really in trouble? Only then do they care? And that's an open research question, I think.
You know that so far nobody has wanted to stand up to defend the ECB as a great enforcer. Marco, before you, I know you want to talk more about the euro area budget. Catherine, did you want to comment on any of these things?
I think it's a kind of with Emmanuel that there's been, so much foundational discussion about fiscal policy, and it is kind of, as Valtraud is kind of saying, it's a much more keenly felt aspect, maybe even in monetary policy, in terms of the people's feelings of entitlement to certain services and the kind of as you say, the different philosophies. The other side of this, of course, is the taxation, not just the spending, and how the European institutions will raise the money in which to provide the reinsurance fund, and where that's going to come from. And again, I keep saying I'm from Britain here, but the outsider view is, well, how far attenuated is your population and your democracy from the people who are making the decisions, and all this sort of stuff will also play differently across different European states. I also speak as a Canadian from Nova Scotia, which is one of the more deprived areas of Canada, which is another federal system with provincial taxes and transfer payments. And the problem is when there's persistent debtors and persistent surplus countries. So even now you get the Alberta freedom movement wanting to leave Canada and this sort of thing. So that kind of pull of rich and poor, even in a country like Canada, I think is salutary.
Marco.
Think, on the euro area budget. Now, if I go back in life and land on my previous job again, I would say it's not going to happen. I mean, we tried very hard before COVID in 2017, etc. And what we devised was an investment protection instrument, European investment protection instrument, which it went basically nowhere, and it was buried then by the COVID crisis, and insurance reappeared. At the same time, I think in the spirit of the lab, I think we should try to devise the conditions and the design to make sure that this is something which I think would be necessary, so to give a better chance to happen. So 3 considerations on this. First, I fully agree with Valtraud. I think it's for reinsurance purposes, and also Giancarlo said that. So it is not for fine tuning. It's not for normal cyclical management. This is something which I think we should reassure those who are skeptical about the active role of fiscal policy at the European level. Second point is that I think the issue of moral hazard always comes back when we discuss these things here. So what is the argument? The argument is that if you have help in terms of cyclical stabilization at the central level, you do not do enough effort to create a room for maneuver on the fiscal side at the national level. I think this can easily be tackled through eligibility conditions, which would address the issue. The third point, again, I think maybe Valtraud en passant referred to that. I think in a situation of endemic uncertainty, as we are living, and we will live now in the future, we will not know who is the beneficiary of this looking forward. So the fact that you have this, a pattern of winners and losers, which are different than in the past when it was very codified, I think should be an argument that should, push those also who are skeptical to see that they could be on the beneficiary side. So 3 conditions: so reinsurance, no fine tuning, eligibility conditions, and bringing in this pattern of endemic uncertainty. Just one very short comment on you, Martin. It is true that what you mentioned is private risk sharing versus public risk sharing. However, until we will be like the US, so verify in the future, what you have is that the private risk sharing dries out in periods of crisis. So the two are not in alternative. So you need the two elements because in more normal times, private risk sharing may do most of the job. I think in crisis time, it will not.
And that is, of course, a separate argument for banking union in addition to the doom loop argument, I think. Before I move on, I want to see if we haven't answered the challenge about whether the ECB is becoming a great enforcer and whether that's right. Does anyone want to defend the ECB, for example? Anyone on the panel first? Adam.
I mean, could one understand those clauses less as an actual threat, though of course 2011 would be a moment in which the threat was exercised. But more generally, aren't they ways in which the lawyers of the ECB persuade themselves that they can act and signal to the market that they potentially, hypothetically, in the extreme case, would act? And then the market doesn't exert the pressure, which means that you never actually have to act. But the entire construction is driven, I was thinking about the conversation we were having, by the very, very clever lawyers in the ECB, which have to devise these mechanisms, because otherwise they can't credibly promise to do what they hope never to have to do. And once having made this semi-legally convincing argument, they don't have to do it.
I suppose there's also a substantive debate to be had on whether there should be conditions on helping, right? You wanted to come in on this topic, I think. Yes.
Yes, Tomasz Woźniakowski, a postdoc at Lewis in Roman, assistant professor at the University of Wrocław in Poland. Just to follow up on the EU budget and the EU fiscal capacity, a lot of you mentioned the comparison with the US. So when the Americans were debating on whether or not to create a fiscal union, so to give the federal government the power to tax in 1787, 88. What they did, they linked both sides of the budget, right? So where the money will come from and how they're gonna be spent. So the frugal for the Netherlands of their back then, so it was the New York State. New York State was, the biggest port. New York, the state the most exposed to foreign invasion, the British invasion. 2/3 of the state budget was coming from the tariff. So it was very hard to convince New York that they should give up this source and to shift it to the federal level. So the way it was done, it was done by linking the two sides of the budget, by saying, okay, you're gonna give up this source. We, federal government, will take it over, but at the same time, we will take care of the military spending. We'll take care of the military spending, invasion, and so on. So you won't have to worry about it. And it was successful. It took Alexander Hamilton, Madison, and Jay and the convention to convince the anti-federalists, but they were successful, right? So it worked. And at the time, by the way, there was no monetary integration, right? So the fiscal union came first. So there was no discussion on how to make a dollar work, how to make our monetary union work. A greenback dollar came about only during the Civil War, right? So the argument was more very pragmatic. We, federal government, we can take, we will be more efficient in collecting tariffs, uniform rate, and so on and so forth. It will allow us to have a lower borrowing rate. So the credit will be more credible when it comes to market and so on. So my question to the panelists is, what if we discuss the EU budget, what in your view would be the best, not the most, feasible, because we know everything is impossible until it is possible, right? What it's the best, in your view, function of the EU or Euro area budget, the large budget, and where the money should come from? So what kind of taxes should be shifted to the EU level, just like tariff was shifted to the federal level back in the US. And the military spending was shifted to the EU level. You, Marty, mentioned defense, which in your view could be more feasible to have large EU 27 budget for the defense rather than the Euro budget. But so that's the one idea. But where the money should come from, in your view?
And just adding to this question, is there any logic for having, whatever your answer is there a logic for having it at Euro area level rather than EU level? Let's just see if anyone wants to pick up on this. Beltrud.
I think it was one of the the hidden wisdom of the Recovery and Resilience Fund, that Merkel did it because she wanted to get the Eurobond debate off the table. That's why she was happy to create an EU fund. But there was also some wisdom in that, because do you really want to drive out Sweden, Denmark, countries that are not in the EU? I mean, this is asking too much. These are rich countries that are netto payers and net payers into the budget. This would be more dangerous than Brexit was. And if you allow me to one sentence or one example to Stefano Mikosi's question that we still have not answered. I mean, on some level, or Adam said something about it, but on some level, of course, nobody thinks the ECB should just have this kind of power. There was this debate early on whether the ECB should actually be a co-enforcer of the Stability and Growth Pact. And actually there you could see more of an argument, because it is about the policy mix and fiscal stabilization and so on, to say any country that is in an excessive deficit procedure with the SG, with the Stability and Growth Pact, should not have its banks note, its bonds will not be accepted anymore at the discount window of the ECB. The ECB shied away from this, never tried to do this, because I think the danger is it is not on their side. They do want to have a life in the shadow. They don't want to be constantly out there criticized for such policy decisions. It's why I would trust that they don't seek this. If you think back, this misspeak spoken by Christine Lagarde, we are not here to narrow spreads, was in a speech in which she wanted to say, you member states need to take responsibilities. We cannot be constantly the sole game in town. In other words, they do want this to be taken somewhere, these decisions being taken somewhere else, which is why I would not see so much that problem, to be honest. But if they would, I think it would be completely undemocratic, of course.
Did you want to come back quickly? Quickly, because
Not
we're getting to
really,
the end.
On this, I would like to come back to this discussion on the role of the European budget. We should not be overlooking the fact that the coming legislature is going to bring about a complete change in environment and policies. Enlargement. The sole enlargement to Ukraine requires that you destroy completely the present system of redistribution through the European budget. I think Marco is perfectly right. There will be no appetite for this discussion, because we will be confronting very difficult distributional issues through the European budget, because substantial resources will have to be allocated elsewhere. There is no appetite today in Brussels for discussing macro policy coordination. It's simply not on the table. All this has been, a great party of 750 billion distributed by the European Commission for all these recovery and the productivity programs. What will happen out of them, I don't know. But I think the next legislature, the discussion would be about enlargement, which will completely change the shape of the European budget. And we better prepare thinking about that.
Emmanuel.
Yeah, no, just quickly, I think it's definitely very difficult to disentangle the role of the budget within the euro area and the rest of the European Union. To answer with much delay, to address with much delay Torsten's remark about the ESM, I agree, why not have something like this for other aspects, but the ESM is very, 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 very specific to the euro area. It's difficult to make the counterfactual again that the ESM would have been needed for the other member states of the EU that are not part of the euro. Then on the question of the budget and where the new resources could come from, may I try to to change a bit the terms of the debate in the sense that you may not necessarily need new resources. So in the plans that were devised about European unemployment insurance, if you, in the 70s, 80s, if you think of a European unemployment insurance, there is only a minimum contribution, and that then you got top-ups that vary from member states who want to be more generous than others. The minimum contribution can just come from the contributions that would normally go to a national pot and instead go to a European pot. So the employer's contribution, the worker's contribution, instead of going to the national system, would go to the European system. And in that sense, you got more resources indeed that are managed by the EU, but you don't have a new resource that is created. It doesn't cost more money in the end. But still, you have a European unemployment system that can provide automatic transfers of resources and be useful in terms of redistribution for the euro area.
I'd like to read out a comment. I'd like to read out a comment from Jean Pisani-Ferry, formerly of this parish, and it goes back to our essay question. So Jean says, one big surprise with the outturn of the euro is that the trade effects have been extremely disappointing. At the time of agreeing on the euro, it was widely assumed that there could not be a single market without fixed exchange rates. And I suppose the converse is also true. People expected monetary unification to boost trade by removing transaction costs and variability. So here is something that was not expected. Would anyone like to comment? Barry, maybe? No. Anybody else? Don't make me call on all of you.
I guess a lot of the trade effects of integration were achieved before the euro is introduced, and indeed in the discussions and the institutional changes in the run-up, perhaps would be what how I would explain it.
Also potentially underestimating the role that the euro has played de facto in transactions with the extended workbench systems that Germany operates in Eastern Europe, which I imagine are to a considerable extent accounted for in euros. So even though those states have not joined the euro area directly, a lot of the internal accounting that's going on when the Germans produce in Hungary or whatever is presumably that's the kind of wider ambit, if you see what I mean. So it's not so much a trade effect as a sort of productive integration and a de facto implicit hegemony that the euro is exercising in that particular bit of the regional economy.
Well, I suppose that could be taken to prove that you don't need to join the euro fully fledged,
Absolutely,
right? It's you euroize the supply chain.
It shows you that something more than the Deutschmark might have been necessary to make that possible.
There was, I mean, like if you take a cynical view, there was a specialization towards non-tradable and tradable in the two parties, and there was a huge trade flows from the north to the south. So there is some trade. This is not the trade effect we wanted, like with us producing Fiat and exchanging them for Volkswagens. But there was a trade effect. We were not like that. But it had an effect. I'm not sure it was the euro per se, but the balances were pretty large.
I suppose we can also speculate that the lack of a unified banking system and the relative fragmentation that happened after the crisis actually makes trade harder because financial flows get harder than trade gets harder.
Can I just add one nuisance to the Ukraine challenge? Sorry, it's just 10 to 7, so it's maybe too late. Demography and technology. I mean, demography aging is a problem in Europe, and innovation and technology lags and gap with the US is pretty large. And with other countries in terms of R&D is basically almost, there are indicators that they're leveling off. So it's not only Ukraine that may create the problem for Europe, but the fact that we may have, so that there are certain people that I respect tend to look at the demographic drive as one of the main factors of, for example, the disappointing performance of Italy and other countries. Just because this thing may not be on the table, but may come on the table back. Think about their insurance, the health system, the retirement, the social security.
On Ukraine, I think here we'll have to bite the bullet and say the truth. And that the rules of the EU, and I must say here Euro area specific, I mean, the decision making, I think will have to be tackled in advance of the enlargement. The risk there otherwise is going to be a complete paralysis of decision making, because we are not talking only about Ukraine. For the decision making, it's important the other countries also, even the smaller ones. And if you think about operating with this budget, with this decision making at 35, 36 countries, I think we risk a lot. But the question here on is Eurozone enlargement related to this? Okay, I tell you just a little episode, but now it's finished, but anecdotal, but telling. 2009, before the crisis of the Eurozone, we had the crisis of Eastern Europe. Question came, what do we do with Latvia? Latvia had the almost a currency board, quasi-currency board, so very, very tight fixed exchange rate. IMF, Latvia should abandon the quasi-currency board, let fluctuate, and then maybe later we repeg. We work with the IMF. We did a lot of simulations at the way we do properly in the Commission. And I went to the Commissioner Almunia with my team and presented all these various simulations. So pros and cons of abandoning the peg there. So devaluation effects, competitiveness versus euroization effects, etc. Commissioner looked at me, not saying a word during the whole explanation, and then he said, Marco, you have understood nothing. And I said, well, I've lost my job because I mean, I have just been appointed Director General. So, and he said, I do not want to have a mid-sized European oligarch to buy Latvia. So we do not abandon the peg, full stop. So I realized that I had not lost my job, which was a great thing. And that was the final answer. So the question here, I mentioned this because then the geostrategic attraction of being at the core of the Eurozone played for these small countries, the Baltics in particular, etc. So that, that was. Now, to what extent you have this kind of attraction, political attraction, working also, say, for the other countries within the EU now, and Poland is a big question now with the change of government, and eventually for the others coming later.
Latvia suffered.
No, but they were ready to do it.
They wanted it.
Ready to do it.
Yeah, but I mean, you would also have ruined the household sector, right? They had mortgages in euro and in other currencies. If you devalue that to that extent, you wipe them out. And that was the reason. I mean, in this case, I think the commissioner has understood nothing about economics, and it just so happened that the political and the economic chimed.
And if the counterfactual was that the country would have been bought by a Russian oligarch, then that probably dominates everything else, which relates to the Ukraine discussion. Of course, it's Andres Sapir has commented online that he disagrees about the effect of the enlargement to Ukraine on the EU budget. The 2004 enlargement did not radically or even substantially change the EU budget. I'll just add that there are now several sort of reports out there looking at this, and they come to somewhat different conclusions. I noticed that the numbers leaked from the council for reasons unknown to me make it look very bad, and some of the independent reports make it look very manageable. I will add on my own account that there's more than 200 billion euros in Russian central bank foreign exchange reserves sitting in the Eurozone, and that there's an ESM with even more than that of unused borrowing capacity that possibly could be repurposed with some legal footwork. we are running out of time, and your timetable, Marco and Giancarlo, you really had set aside 15 minutes for closing remarks, but I judged that it was better to keep the debate going instead. But for the panelists, I mean, I basically just let the panelists continue the debate. So I'm going to wrap that part up now. Just say how great a lab session. I don't want to say a panel debate, but a lab session this has been, where we've covered a lot of ground, and we've seen some things that are the same debates we've had for a long time on fiscal centralization or decentralization, for example. We've seen some topics where it turns out that what the monetary unification does is to make old problems just turn up in new guises. That was true of the balance of payments crisis back in the Eurozone crisis. It's true of how the subsidy race is an echo of competitive devaluation from the past. And we've covered some areas where the question comes up whether it's really an EMU issue or just a single market issue or some other constellation of EU countries issue. So I think we've done good work. So I'm just going to thank the panelists and then hand back to our host. I think either Marco, Giancarlo, or both. I give it back to you.
Yeah, well, very quickly. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And actually, we should thank all the staff and Diego, Michele, Odysseas for helping us organizing this, and Elena. I'm sure I forget somebody. I just want to conclude, like in every nice concert, people get out happy whistling tunes. So I put down the tunes I was whistling after this symphony or quartet. No, it's not a quartet, sorry. We are like many. It's an octet, a sextet. So I just say the sentence that some of them I misquote, okay? So the sentence I like: make the EA economy work better rather than make the EA work better, I think is a good line. In the fiscal policy, for example, we learned came out of the common market discussion, not of the EA. I already quoted the no one wanted the revolution, and it's another good thing because it tells us that we need to go through reform. I misquote Vartrau, sorry for that. Economists were the only one venturing on expectations, so that we're the only one wrong, which is a good coincidence. But remember, there is something to learn because she mentioned at the time the whole debate was around currency stability and German dominance, which was actually two big topics. So like the context change and our perception, the way we see things change. I love solid for the moment. The EA is solid for the moment, which is a deep statement because it's linked to enlargement. And the enlargement comes to my precious quotation from the panel, which is, I thought the EUI was incomplete, but I understand the better way to say it is the EI is underdetermined, which was because we don't know what complete EA is. I think I like, I'm going to use it. It's underdetermined AI. I also learned that there is a cost in undetermined that we share, that we can discuss about how to measure the cost, but definitely a cost. And then Barry is sort of telling me that I'm doing the EA lab EMU Lab for my grandchildren, because it will take under 50 years at the best to get, and thinking about the working for our grandchildren, I would like to change a little bit the demand. The question was not who are we, but what do we care about? And I think it's still true that at the end of the day, at the end of this, and the single market EA policy vision is a sustainable, inclusive, stable economic system. Notice that I don't say growth, okay? I say a sustainable, inclusive, stable economic system in a democracy. And that is something to care about a lot. I will stop here.
Okay.
And also a round of applause to us. You can do that.
We do that. We do that certainly. I mean, just to reiterate the thanks to all of them. I think it has been lively, very inspiring debate. So we have learned that the euro is not 25 years old or 25 years young. Yes. If you take a long-term perspective. So we go for dinner, and for dinner I announced it will be George Papacostantino, who is going to share with us his wisdom, having had several hats, including direct political responsibility during the hard times in Greece. I think he will be just the right person to illuminate us. So many thanks to all, and a round of applause to everybody.